4. Organizational questions. The consideration that it was urgent to establish a vast concentration of revolutionary forces carried a lot of weight when the Comintern was founded, because at the time it was anticipated that there would be a far more rapid development of objective conditions. Nevertheless, we can now see that it would have been preferable to establish more rigorous organizational criteria. The formation of parties and the conquest of the masses has been favored neither by concessions to anarchist and syndicalist groups, nor by the small compromises with the centrists allowed for by the 21 conditions, neither has it been favored by organic fusions with parties or fractions of parties as a result of political infiltration, nor by tolerating a dual communist organization in some countries with sympathizer parties. The watchword, launched after the Fifth Congress, of organizing the party on the basis of factory cells, hasn't achieved its objective, which was to remedy the glaring defects that exist in the various sections of the International. Once applied as a general rule, especially in the way the Italian leadership has interpreted it, this watchword lends itself to serious errors and to deviation both from the Marxist postulate that revolution isn't a question of forms of organization, and from the Leninist thesis that an organic solution can never be valid for all times and all places. For parties operating in bourgeois countries with a stable parliamentary regime, organization on a factory cell basis is less suitable than territorial units. It is also a theoretical error to assert that whilst parties organized on a territorial basis are social democratic parties, those based on cells are genuine communist parties. In practice, the cell type of organization makes it even more difficult to carry out the party's task of unification amongst proletarians and trade and industry groups, a task that is all the more important the more unfavorable the situation is and the more the possibilities of proletarian organization are reduced. Various drawbacks of a practical nature are connected with the proposal to organize the party on the exclusive basis of factory cells. In Tsarist Russia, the issue appeared in a different context. Relations between the owners of industry and the state were different, and the obligation of posing the central question of power rendered the corporatist danger less acute. The factory cell system does not increase workers' influence in the party, since the key links in the network all consist of the non-worker and ex-worker elements which constitute the official party apparatus. Given the faulty working methods of the International, the watchword Bolshevization, from the organizational point of view, manifests as a pedestrian and inadequate application of the Russian experience, which has in many countries already prompted a paralysis, albeit unintentional, of spontaneous initiatives and proletarian and classist energies by means of an apparatus whose selection and functions are for the most part artificial. Keeping the organization of the party on a territorial basis doesn't mean having to relinquish party organs in the factories. Indeed, there must be communist groups there, linked to the party and subject to party discipline, in order to form its trade union framework. This method establishes a much better connection with the masses and keeps the party's main organization less visible. 5. Discipline and fractions. Another aspect of the call for Bolshevization is the complete centralization of discipline, and the strict prohibition of fractionism are considered the secure guarantee of the party's effectiveness. The final court of appeal for all controversial questions is the Central International organ, within which at least political, if not hierarchical, hegemony is attributed to the Russian Communist Party. Actually, this guarantee is non-existent, and the whole approach to the problem is inadequate. In fact, rather than preventing the spread of fractionism within the International, it has been encouraged to assume masked and hypocritical forms instead. From a historical point of view, the overcoming of fractions in the Russian party wasn't an expedient, nor a magical recipe, applied on statutory grounds, but was both the result and the expression of a faithful delineation of the problems of doctrine and political action. Disciplinary sanctions are one of the elements that ensure against degeneration, but only on condition that their application remains within the limits of exceptional cases, and doesn't become the norm and virtually the ideal of the party's functioning. The solution doesn't reside in a useless increase in hierarchical authoritarianism, whose initial investiture is lacking both because of the incompleteness of the historical experiences in Russia, impressive though they are, and because even within the old guard, the custodian of the Bolshevik traditions, disagreements have been resolved in ways which cannot be considered as a priori the best ones. But neither does the solution lie in the systematic application of the principles of formal democracy, which for Marxism have no other function than as organizational practices which can be occasionally convenient. The Communist parties must achieve an organic centralism which, whilst including maximum possible consultation with the base, ensures a spontaneous elimination of any grouping which aims to differentiate itself. This cannot be achieved with, as Lenin put it, the formal and mechanical prescriptions of a hierarchy, but through correct revolutionary politics. The repression of fractionism isn't a fundamental aspect of the evolution of the party, though preventing it is. To claim that the party and the International are mysteriously insured against a relapse, or the tendency to relapse, into opportunism is not only fruitless and absurd but extremely dangerous, because such a relapse could indeed occur either due to changing circumstances, or to the playing out of residual social democratic traditions. We have to admit that every differentiation of opinion not reducible to cases of conscience, or personal defeatism, may develop a useful function in the resolution of our problems and protect the party, and the proletariat in general, from grave dangers. If such dangers become accentuated, then differentiation will inevitably, but usefully, take on the fractionist form, and this might lead to schisms. However, this won't happen because of childish reasons, because the leaders haven't put enough energy into repressing everybody, but only given the terrible hypothesis of a failure of the party and its becoming subservient to counter-revolutionary influences. We have an example of the wrong method in the artificial solutions applied to the plight of the German party after the opportunist crisis in 1923, when whilst these artifices failed to eliminate fractionism, they at the same time hindered the spontaneous determination within the ranks of the highly advanced German proletariat of a correct classist and revolutionary response to the degeneration of the party. The danger of bourgeois influences acting on the class party doesn't appear historically as the organization of fractions, but rather as a shrewd penetration stoking up unitary demagoguery and operating as a dictatorship from above, and immobilizing initiatives by the proletarian vanguard. This defeatist factor cannot be identified and eliminated by posing the question of discipline in order to prevent fractionist initiatives, but rather by successfully managing to orientate the party and the proletariat against such a peril at the moment when it manifests itself not just as a doctrinal revision, but as an express proposal for an important political maneuver with anti-classist consequences. One negative effect of so-called Bolshevization has been the replacing of conscious and thoroughgoing political elaboration inside the party, corresponding to significant progress towards a really compact centralism, with superficial and noisy agitation for mechanical formulas of unity for unity's sake, and discipline for discipline's sake. This method causes damage to both the party and the proletariat in that it holds back the realization of the true Communist Party. Once applied to several sections of the International, it becomes itself a serious indication of latent opportunism. At the moment, there doesn't appear to be any international left opposition within the Comintern, but if the unfavorable factors we have mentioned worsen, the formation of such an opposition will be at the same time both a revolutionary necessity and a spontaneous reflex to the situation. 6. Tactical questions up to the Fifth Congress. Mistaken decisions have been made in the way the tactical problems posed by the previously mentioned international situations were settled. Like analogous mistakes made in the organizational sphere, they derive from the claim that everything can be deduced from problems previously faced by the Russian Communist Party. The United Front tactic shouldn't be interpreted as a political coalition with other so-called workers' parties, but as a utilization of immediate demands in particular situations to increase the Communist Party's influence over the masses without compromising its autonomous position. The basis for the United Front must therefore be sought in the proletarian organizations which workers join because of their social position and independently of their political faith or affiliation to an organized party. The reason is twofold. Firstly, communists aren't prevented from criticizing other parties, or gradually recruiting new members who used to be dependent on these other parties into the ranks of the Communist Party, and secondly, It ensures that the masses will understand the party when it eventually calls on them to mobilize behind its program and under its exclusive leadership. Experience has shown us countless times that the only way of ensuring a revolutionary application of the United Front lies in rejecting political coalitions, whether permanent or temporary, along with committees which include representatives of different political parties as means of directing the struggle. Also, there should be no negotiations, proposals for common action and open letters to other parties from the Communist Party. Practical experience has proved how fruitless these methods are, and even any initial effect has been discredited by the abuses to which they have been put. The political United Front based on the central demand of the seizure of the state becomes the workers' government tactic. Here we have not only an erroneous tactic, but also a blatant contradiction of the principles of communism. Once the party issues the call for the assumption of power by the proletariat through the representative organisms of the bourgeois state apparatus, or even merely refrains from explicitly condemning such an eventuality, then it has abandoned and rejected the communist program not only vis-à-vis proletarian ideology, with all the inevitable damaging consequences, but because the party itself would be establishing and accrediting this ideological formulation. The revision to this tactic made at the Fifth Congress, after the defeat in Germany, hasn't proved satisfactory, and the latest developments in the realm of tactical experimentation justify calls for the abandonment of even the expression, workers' government. As far as the central problem of the state is concerned, the party should issue the call for the dictatorship of the proletariat and that alone. There is no other workers' government. The slogan workers' government leads to opportunism, and to opportunism alone, that is support for, or participation in, self-styled pro-worker governments of the bourgeois class. None of this contradicts the slogan, all power to the Soviets and to Soviet-type organisms, representative bodies elected by workers, even when opportunist parties predominate in them. The opportunist parties oppose the assumption of power by proletarian organizations, since this is precisely the proletarian dictatorship, exclusion of non-workers from the elective organs and power, which the Communist Party alone will be able to accomplish. Suffice to say, the formula of the dictatorship of the proletariat has one synonym and one alone, the government of the Communist Party. 7. The question of the new tactics. The United Front and the workers' government used to be justified on the following grounds: that just having communist parties wasn't enough to achieve victory, since it was necessary to conquer the masses, and in order to conquer the masses, the influence of the Social Democrats had to be fought on the terrain of those demands which are understood by all workers. Today, a second step has been taken, and a perilous question is posed. To ensure our victory, they say, we must first ensure that the bourgeoisie is governing in a tolerant and compliant way, or, that classes intermediate between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat should govern, allowing us to make preparations. This latter position, by admitting the possibility of a government originating from the middle classes, sinks to the total revision of Marx's doctrine and is equivalent to the counter-revolutionary platform of reformism. The first position aims to refer solely to the objective utility of conditions insofar as they allow propaganda, agitation and organization to be better carried out. But as we have already pointed out with regard to particular situations, both are equally dangerous. Everything leads us to predict that liberalism and bourgeois democracy, whether in antithesis or in synthesis with the fascist method, will evolve in such a way as to exclude the Communist Party from their juridical guarantees, for what little they're worth, since it places itself outside them by negating such guarantees in its program. Such an evolution in no way contradicts the principles of bourgeois democracy, and in any case, it has real precedence in the work of all of the so-called left-wing governments, and, for example, in the program of the Italian Aventine Parliament. Any freedom given to the proletariat will just mean substantially greater freedom for counter-revolutionary agents to agitate and organize within its ranks. The only freedom for the proletariat lies in its dictatorship. We have already mentioned that even if a left-wing government created conditions that we found useful, they could only be exploited if the party had consistently held to clearly autonomous positions. It isn't a matter of attributing diabolical cleverness to the bourgeoisie, but of holding on to the certainty, without which it is possible to call oneself a communist, that during the final struggle the conquests of the proletariat will come up against a united front of the bourgeois forces, be they personified by Hindenburg, MacDonald, Mussolini or Nosk. To habituate the proletariat to picking out voluntary or involuntary supporters from within this bourgeois front would be to introduce a factor of defeat, even if any intrinsic weakness of any part of this front will clearly be a factor of victory. In Germany after the election of Hindenburg, an electoral alliance with Social Democracy and with other Republican parties, that is bourgeois parties, such as the Parliamentary Alliance and the Prussian Landtag, was proclaimed in order to avoid a right-wing government. In France, support was given to the cartel des gauches in the last municipal elections, the Clichy tactic. For the reasons given above, such tactical methods must be declared unacceptable. Even the theses of the Second Congress of the CI on revolutionary parliamentarism impose on the Communist Party the duty of only operating on electoral terrain on the basis of rigorously independent positions. The examples of recent tactics indicated above show a clear, though not complete, historical affinity with the traditional methods of the Second International, electoral blocs and collaborationism, which were also justified by laying claim to a Marxist interpretation. Such methods represent a real danger to the principles and organization of the International. Incidentally, no international congresses have passed resolutions which authorize them, and that includes the tactical theses presented at the Fifth Congress. 8. The Union Question. On the global level, the International has successively modified its conception of the relationship between political and economic organisms. Herein lies a remarkable example of the method which, rather than having particular actions derived from principles, prefers to improvise various new theories to justify actions chosen because of their apparent ease of execution and their likelihood of producing quick results. The International originally supported the admission of unions to the Communist International, then it formed a Red International Labor Union. It was held that, since the unions were the best point of contact with the masses, each communist party should struggle for trade union unity and therefore not create its own unions through scissions from unions led by the Yellows. Nevertheless, on the international level, the Bureau of the Amsterdam International was to be considered and treated not as an organization of the proletarian masses, but as a counter-revolutionary political organ of the League of Nations. At a certain point, based on considerations which were certainly very important, but limited mainly to a project for using the left wing of the English Union movement, it was announced that the Red International Labor Union should be abandoned in order to effect an organic unity, on an international scale, with the Amsterdam Bureau. No amount of conjecture about changing circumstances can justify such a major policy shift, since the question of the relations between international political organizations and trade unions is one of principle, inasmuch as it boils down to that of the relations between party and class for the revolutionary mobilization. Internal statutory guarantees weren't respected either, since this decision was presented to the relevant international organs as a fait accompli. The retention of Moscow against Amsterdam as our watchword hasn't prevented the struggle for trade union unity in each nation, and nor will it. In fact, the liquidation of separatist tendencies in the unions, Germany and Italy, was only made possible by addressing the separatists' argument that the proletariat was being prevented from freeing itself from the influence of the Amsterdam International. On the other hand, the apparent enthusiasm with which our party in France adhered to the proposition of World Trade Union unity didn't prevent it from demonstrating an absolute incapacity to deal de facto with the problem of trade union unity at a national level in a non-secessionist way. The utility of a united front tactic on a world basis isn't however ruled out, even with union organizations that belong to the Amsterdam International. The left wing of the Italian party has always supported and struggled for proletarian unity in the trade unions, and this serves to distinguish it from the profoundly syndicalist and voluntarist pseudo-lefts which were fought by Lenin. Furthermore, the left in Italy has a thoroughly Leninist conception of the problem of the relations between trade unions and factory councils. On the basis of the Russian experience and of the relevant theses of the Second Congress, the left rejects the serious deviation from principle which consists of depriving the trade unions, based on voluntary membership, of any revolutionary importance in order to substitute the utopian and reactionary concept of a constitutional apparatus with obligatory membership which extends organically over the entire area of the system of capitalist production. In practice, this error is expressed by an overestimation of the role of the factory councils to the extent of effectively boycotting the trade union. 9. The agrarian question. The agrarian question has been defined by Lenin's theses at the Second Congress of the International. The main aim of these theses was to restore the problem of agricultural production to its historic place in the Marxist system, and show that in an epoch where the premises for the socialization of enterprises had already matured in the industrial economy, they were still lacking in the agricultural economy. Far from delaying the proletarian revolution, which alone will create these premises, this state of affairs renders the problems of the poor peasants insoluble within the framework of industrial economy and bourgeois power. This allows the proletariat to link up its own struggle with freeing the poor peasant from a system of exploitation by the landed proprietors and the bourgeoisie, even if freeing the peasants doesn't coincide with the general change in the rural productive economy. Large-scale landed property, deemed as such in law, is technically speaking composed of tiny productive enterprises. When the legal superstructure that holds it together is destroyed, we witness a redivision of land amongst the peasants. In reality, this is nothing other than the freeing of these small productive enterprises already separated from a collective exploitation. This can only happen if the property relations are broken up in a revolutionary way, but the protagonist of this rupture can only be the industrial proletariat. The reason for this is that the proletariat, as distinct from the peasant, isn't merely a victim of the relations of bourgeois production but is the historical product of its maturity, condemning it to clear the path to a new, different system of production. The proletariat will therefore find precious reinforcements in the revolt of the poor peasant. The essential elements in Lenin's tactical conclusions are, firstly, that there is a fundamental distinction to be made between the proletariat's relations with the peasant class, and its relations with the reactionary middle strata of the urban economy, mainly represented by the social democratic parties, and secondly, there is the definitive principle of the preeminence and hegemony of the working class as leader of the revolution. The peasant therefore appears at the moment of the conquest of power as a revolutionary factor, but if during the revolution his ideology is modified as regards the old forms of authority and legality, it doesn't change much with regard to the relations of production which remain the traditional ones of isolated family farms in mutual competition with one another. Thus the peasant still represents a threat to the construction of the socialist economy, and only the large-scale development of productive capacity and agricultural technology is likely to interest him. On the tactical and organizational plane, the landless agricultural proletariat, day laborers, must be considered, in Lenin's view, the same as the rest of the proletariat, and be incorporated into the same framework. The policy of proletarian alliance with the poor peasants, working alone on their plots of land on whatever level of sufficiency, becomes a policy of mere neutralization with regard to the middle peasant, who is characterized as being both a victim of certain capitalist relations and an exploiter of labor. Finally, there is the wealthy peasant who is generally an exploiter of labor and the direct enemy of the revolution. In the field of agrarian tactics, the International must avoid those mistaken applications already discernible, for instance in the policies of the French party, which is drawn to the idea of a new type of peasant revolution to be considered on the same level as the workers' revolution, or to the belief that the revolutionary movement of the workers may be determined by an insurrection in the countryside, whilst in fact the actual relationship is the other way around. The peasant, once won over to the communist program, and therefore accessible to political organization, should become a member of the Communist Party. This is the only way to combat the rise of parties composed solely of peasants inevitably prey to counter-revolutionary influences. The Krestintern, Peasants' International, must incorporate the peasant organizations of all countries characterized, like workers' trade unions, by the fact of accepting as members all those who have the same immediate economic interests. Also the tactics of political negotiations, the United Front, or constitution of fractions within the peasant parties, even with the intention of breaking them up, must be rejected. This tactical norm is not at odds with the relations established between the Bolsheviks and the social revolutionaries during the Civil War period, when the new representative organizations of the proletariat and the peasants already existed. 10. The national question. Lenin has also produced a fundamental clarification of the theory of the popular movements in colonial countries and in certain exceptionally backward countries. Even though internal economic development and the expansion of foreign capital hasn't provided a mature basis for modern class struggle in these countries, demands are being made which can only be resolved by insurrectional struggle and the defeat of world imperialism. In the epoch of struggle for proletarian revolution in the metropolises, the complete realization of these two conditions will allow the launching of a struggle which, nevertheless, will take on locally the aspects of a conflict not of class but of races and nationalities. The fundamental tenets of the Leninist conception nevertheless still remain that the world struggle will be directed by organs of the revolutionary proletariat, and that the indigenous class struggle, and the independent development of local communist parties, must be encouraged, and never held back or stifled. The extension, however, of these considerations to countries in which the capitalist regime and the bourgeois state apparatus has been established for a long time constitutes a danger, insofar as here the national question and patriotic ideology become counter-revolutionary devices, and serve only to disarm the proletariat as a class. Such deviations appear, for example, in the concessions made by Radek with regard to the German nationalists fighting against the inter-Allied occupation. The International must also call for the stamping out in Czechoslovakia of any nationalist and dualist reaction within the proletarian organizations, since the two races are at the same historical level and their common economic environment is completely evolved. To elevate the struggle of the national minorities, per se, to the level of a matter of principle is therefore to distort the communist conception, since altogether different criteria are required to discern whether such struggles offer revolutionary possibilities or reactionary developments. 11. Russian questions. The new political economy of the Russian state, based mainly on Lenin's 1921 speech on the tax in kind and Trotsky's report to the Fourth World Congress, is evidently an important matter for the Communist International. Given the condition of the Russian economy, and the fact that the bourgeoisie remains in power in the other countries, Marxists couldn't have presented otherwise the prospects for the development of the world revolution, and the construction of the socialist economy. The serious political difficulties that the internal relations of social forces, and the problems of productive technology and foreign relations have caused the Russian state, have led to a series of divergences within the Russian Communist Party, and it is really deplorable that the international communist movement hasn't found a way of making more soundly based and authoritative pronouncements on the matter. In the first discussion with Trotsky, his considerations on the internal life of the party and its new course were undoubtedly correct, and his observations on the development of the state's political economy were also, on the whole, clearly revolutionary and proletarian. In the second discussion he was no less justified when he remarked on the International's mistakes, and demonstrated that the best traditions of the Bolsheviks did not militate in favor of the way the Comintern was being led. The way the party reacted to this internal debate was inadequate and contrived, due to the well-known method of relying on anti-fractionist, and even worse, anti-Bonapartist intimidation based on absolutely nothing of substance. As to the latest discussion, it must above all be realized that it revolves around problems of an international nature, and just because the majority of the Russian Communist Party has pronounced on the issue, there is no reason why the International cannot discuss and pronounce on it in its turn. The question still stands even if has ceased to be asked by the defeated opposition. As has often happened, questions of procedure and discipline have stifled really essential questions. What is at issue here is not the defense of the rights of a minority, whose leaders at least are co-responsible for numerous errors committed on the international level, but rather questions of vital importance for the world movement. The Russian question must be brought before the International for an in-depth study. The following features must be taken into account. Today the Russian economy is composed, according to Lenin, of elements that are pre-bourgeois, bourgeois, state capitalist and socialist. State-controlled large-scale industry is socialist insofar as it is production organized by, and in the hands of a politically proletarian state. The distribution of the products derived from this industry operates however under a capitalist form, namely, through a competitive free market mechanism. One cannot deny in principle that workers will not only be kept in less than brilliant economic circumstances by this system, in fact it is the case, even if they do accept it because of the revolutionary consciousness they have acquired, but that it will also evolve in the direction of an increased extraction of surplus value by means of the price paid by the worker for foodstuffs, and the prices paid by the state for its purchases, as well as the conditions it obtains in concessions, commerce and in all its relations with foreign capitalism. It is therefore necessary to ask whether the socialist elements in the Russian economy are increasing or decreasing, a problem that also means taking into account the degree of technical efficiency and how well the state industries are organized. The building of full socialism extended to production and distribution, to industry and agriculture, is impossible in just one country. But the progressive development of the socialist elements in the Russian economy can nevertheless be achieved by thwarting the plans of the counter-revolutionaries, supported inside Russia by the rich peasants, new bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie, and outside the country by the imperialist powers. Whether such counter-revolutionary plotting takes the form of internal or external aggression, or of a progressive sabotage and influencing of Russian social and state life such as to force a progressive involution and the proletarianization of its main features, it is a fundamental condition for success that all parties belonging to the International collaborate with each other and are able to make their contribution. Above all, it is a matter of assuring the Russian proletariat and the Russian Communist Party of the active support of the proletarian vanguard, especially in the imperialist countries. Not only must aggression be prevented and pressure is exerted against the bourgeois states as regards their relations with Russia, but most importantly of all, the Russian party needs to be helped by its brother parties to resolve its problems. Whilst these other parties, it is true, do not possess direct experience of governmental problems, nonetheless they can help resolve them by acting as a classist and revolutionary coefficient, with experience derived directly from the real class struggles taking place in their respective countries. As we have shown above, the internal relationships of the International do not lend themselves to this task. Urgent changes therefore need to be made in order to redress the problems in the realm of politics and in the tactical and organizational spheres that have been exacerbated by Bolshevization. 3. Italian questions. 1. The Italian situation. 1926. Evaluations of the Italian situation that attribute decisive value to the insufficient development of industrial capitalism are wrong. The weak expansion of industry in a quantitative sense, along with its relatively late historical appearance, were counterbalanced by a set of other circumstances which allowed the bourgeoisie to completely entrench itself politically during the period of the Risorgimento and develop an extremely rich and complex tradition of government. The political polarities that historically characterize conflicting parties, such as the old left and right division, clericalism and masonry, and democracy and fascism, cannot be automatically identified with the social differences which exist between landed proprietors and capitalists, and the big and petty bourgeoisie. The fascist movement must be understood as the attempt to politically unify the conflicting interests of various bourgeois groups under the banner of counter-revolution. Fascism, created and directly fostered by the entire upper classes, landowners, industrialists, commercial sectors, bankers, supported by the traditional state apparatus, the monarchy, the church, and masonry, pursued the same by mobilizing elements within the disintegrating middle classes which, in close alliance with the bourgeoisie as a whole, it has managed to deploy against the proletariat. What has taken place in Italy shouldn't be interpreted as the arrival in power of a new social strata, as the formation of a new state apparatus with a new program and ideology, nor as the defeat of part of the bourgeoisie, whose interests would be better served by the adoption of liberal and parliamentary methods. The Democrats and the liberals, the natists and the Giolitis, are the protagonists of a phase of counter-revolutionary struggle which is dialectically linked to the fascist phase and just as decisive in effecting the proletarian defeat. In fact, it was precisely their concessionary politics, with the complicity of reformists and maximalists, which allowed the bourgeoisie to resist the pressure from the proletariat and head it off during the post-war period of demobilization, at precisely a time when every component of the dominant class was unprepared for a frontal attack. Directly favored in this period by governments, the bureaucracy, the police, judiciary, army etc., fascism has since gone on to completely replace the bourgeoisie's old political personnel. However, we shouldn't be fooled by this, and neither should it serve as a reason for rehabilitating parties and groups who were removed not because they achieved better conditions for the working class, but because for the time being they had completed their anti-proletarian task. 2. Political positions of the communist left. As the above situation was taking shape, the group which formed the Communist Party set out with these criteria: a break from the illusory dualisms of the bourgeois and parliamentary political scene and an affirmation of the revolutionary antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Propaganda amongst the proletariat aimed at destroying the illusion that the middle classes were capable of producing a political general staff, of taking power and clearing the way for proletarian victories, instilling confidence in the proletariat in its own historic task through propaganda based on a series of critical, political and tactical positions which were original and autonomous, and solidly linked through successive situations. The tradition of this political current goes back to the left wing of the Socialist Party before the war. Whilst a majority capable of struggling both against the errors of the reformists and the syndicalists, the latter having personified the proletarian left until then, was formed at the Congresses of Reggio Emilia, 1912, and Ancona, 1914. An extreme left aspiring to even more radical classist solutions also emerged within this majority. Important problems for the working class were correctly resolved during this period, namely with regard to the questions of electoral tactics, links with the trades unions, colonial war and Freemasonry. During the World War, virtually the entire party opposed the Union-Saker politics, and at successive meetings and congresses, Bologna, May 1915, Rome, February 1917, Florence, November 1917, Rome, 1918, its extreme left wing, now clearly differentiated, defended the following Leninist positions: the rejection of national defense and defeatism, exploitation of military defeat to pose the question of power, and unceasing struggle against the opportunist trade union and parliamentary leaders along with the call for their expulsion from the party. Immediately after the war, Il Soviet became the mouthpiece of the extreme left, and the first newspaper to support the policies of the Russian Revolution and to confront anti-Marxist, opportunist, syndicalist, and anarchistic misinterpretations. It correctly set out the essential problems of the proletarian dictatorship and the party's tasks, and from the very start defended the necessity of a split in the Socialist Party. This same group supported electoral abstentionism, but the Second Congress of the International would dismiss its conclusions. Its abstentionism, however, didn't derive from the anti-Marxist theoretical errors of the anarcho-syndicalist type, as its resolute polemics against the anarchist press have shown. The application of the abstentionist tactic was recommended above all for fully developed parliamentary democracies, because this political environment creates particular obstacles to the winning over of the masses to an accurate understanding of the word dictatorship, difficulties which, in our opinion, continue to be underestimated by the International. In the second place, abstentionism was proposed at a time when huge struggles were setting even hugger mass movements into motion, unfortunately not the case today, and not as a tactic applicable for all times and all places. With the 1919 elections, the bourgeois government opened up an immense safety valve to the revolutionary pressure, and diverted the proletarian offensive and the attention of the party by exploiting its tradition of unbridled electoralism. Il Soviet's abstentionism was then entirely correct, in that it responded to the true causes of the proletarian disaster that ensued. At the subsequent Bologna Conference, October 1919, Only the abstentionist minority posed correctly the question of a split with the reformists, but it sought in vain to come to an agreement with a section of the maximalists on this point, even after abstentionism had been renounced in order to achieve it. The attempt having failed, the abstentionist fraction remained the only section of the party which, up until the Second World Congress, worked on a national scale for the formation of the Communist Party. This was therefore the group which represented the spontaneous adherents, setting out from its own experiences and traditions, of the left of the Italian proletariat to the policies of Lenin and Bolshevism which had lately emerged victorious with the Russian Revolution. 3. The work of the party's left leadership. Within the new Communist Party, constituted at Leghorn in January 1921, the abstentionists made every effort to forge solid links with other groupings in the party. But whilst for some of these groups it was international relations alone which necessitated the split from the opportunists, for the abstentionists, who for discipline's sake had expressly renounced their positions on elections, and indeed for many other elements besides, it was because the theses of the International and the lessons of recent political struggles were completely consistent with each other. In its work, the interpretation of the Italian situation and the tasks of the proletariat mentioned earlier inspired the party leadership. With hindsight it is clear that the delay in the formation of the Revolutionary Party, for which the other groups were responsible, made the subsequent proletarian retreat inevitable. In order to place the proletariat in the best position during the ensuing battles, the leadership took the stance that although the greatest efforts should be made to use the traditional apparatus of the Red organizations, it was also necessary to warn the proletariat not to count on anything from the maximalists and reformists, who would even go so far as accepting a peace treaty with fascism. From its very inception, the party defended the principle of trade union unity, going on to propose the central postulate of a united front which culminated in the formation of the Labor Alliance. Whatever opinions one might have about the political United Front, the fact is that the situation in Italy in 1921-22 made it impossibility. In fact, the party never received any invitation to attend any meetings aimed at founding an alliance of parties. The party didn't intervene at the meeting to constitute the trade union alliance called by the railway workers because it didn't want to lend itself to maneuvers which might have compromised the alliance itself, and which might have been blamed on the party. It had already shown beforehand though that it approved of the initiative by stating that all communist workers within the new organization would observe discipline towards it. Certain contacts between political groups would eventually take place. The Communist Party wouldn't refuse to take part but they would come to nothing, demonstrating both the impossibility of arriving at an understanding on the terrain of political action, and the defeatism of every other group. During the retreat, the leadership was able to preserve the confidence of the workers in their own class, and raise the political consciousness of the vanguard, by heading off the traditional maneuverings of pseudo-revolutionary groups and parties within the proletariat. Despite the efforts of the party, it was not until later, August 1922, that a generalized mobilization took place, but proletarian defeat was inevitable and from then on fascism, openly supported in their violent campaigns by the forces of a declaredly liberal democratic state, became master of the country. The March on Rome which happened afterwards merely legitimized fascism's predomination in a formal sense. Even now, despite reduced proletarian activity, the party's influence still predominated over the maximalists and reformists, its progress having already been demonstrated by the 1921 election results and the extensive consultations that took place within the Confederation of Labor.